Welcome back, everybody. This is Eric here with Iraq Veteran 8888. All right, I've got an op-ed that I want to read for you, and I think it's very fascinating because it paints a very interesting type of potential scenario in terms of arguments that we're going to be looking at when it comes to the Bruen landscape, the post-Bruen landscape. The Supreme Court, New York State and Rifle Pistol Association versus Bruen. It's a very, very landmark and important Supreme Court case that sets forth an extremely specific set of circumstances that have to be met in order for laws to pass this new smell test, this new scrutiny. The burden of proof is now on the federal government to provide proof of historical texts, traditions, and all of that sort of stuff, and bearing when the founding of when the Second Amendment came to be, like the historical references of what laws were in those days, whether they limited guns or not, whether they limited people's ability to not have guns or whatever type of regulatory statutes and laws and rules were in place. The federal government must pass the smell test and provide, the burden of proof is now on them to provide some form of reference to original text traditions to determine if the laws that exist are legit or not. And this is a huge thing. If applied properly, should put a stamper in a lot of gun control laws. So we're going to get into this op-ed. It's great. Before we do, I would like to thank our friends at Griffin Armaments for supporting our videos. If you're looking for some of the most awesome suppressors on the market, definitely look at Griffin. They're a veteran-owned and operated company, really great group of people. They've got an awesome Instagram page with some really fun gunplay as well if you want to see some cool stuff. But they've got great mounting systems, really great suppressor designs, very fairly priced, and definitely a huge thanks to them for supporting our efforts, and we definitely support the people that support us here on the channel, and a big thanks to Griffin Armament for taking care of us and helping me keep this content flowing out to you guys. So again, big thanks to them, and definitely get yourself a can and support them and me. All right, let's get into this. This was posted on AmmoLand, April 23rd, 2023. This was written by Mr. Dean Weingarten. It's called Review, the History of Bans and Types of Arms Before 1900. Oh, this is going to be good. Okay, and I glanced over this. I didn't want to read too much too quick. I wanted to be surprised along with you guys, so let's get into this. The History of Bans on Types of Arms Before 1900. USA, The History of Bans on Types of Arms Before 1900 by David Copel and Joseph Greenlee, Law Review article, 165 pages from 2021. The Supreme Court, in the seminal Bruen decision, held, once the clear text of the Second Amendment is implicated, the burden falls on the government to prove that there were widespread and accepted statutory restraints in history which are very similar to the restraints the government is defending. Again, whatever law that exists now, they have to prove it existed way back when, which, of course, is going to be a very difficult task for them to undergo, as you'll see. The Law Review article by Copel and Greenlee is the most comprehensive compilation of the laws on ownership and regulation of arms from medieval England through 1900, especially on weapons bans, yet seen by this correspondent. Those laws are of varying relevance to the interpretation of the Second Amendment. The article is astonishingly comprehensive. From the introduction of the article. All right, this is coming directly from it. This article describes the history of bans on particular types of arms in America through 1899. It also describes arms bans in England until the time of American independence. Arms encompassed in this article include firearms, knives, swords, blunt weapons, and many others. While arms advanced considerably from medieval England through the 19th century United States, bans on particular types of arms were rare. In the early history section of the article, one startling fact revealed was the Royal Charter of King James I in 1606 granted to members of the Virginia Charter perpetual rights to bring sufficient shipping and furniture of armor, weapons, ordnance, powder, victual, and other things necessary for the said plantations and for their use and defense there. The rights were granted to all the settlers of the Virginia colony. The Charter of New England colonies were granted the same rights. The two charters covered all of what would become the original 13 colonies, except for the Middle Region, which contained New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and New Jersey. These colonies were originally part of New Netherland and were conquered by England in 1664. Thus, most of the colonists in America had the rights to arms before the right to arms was included in the English Bill of Rights in 1689. As part of the colonial history section, there is a well-done glossary of terms used to describe various arms during colonial times. Starting on page 37, the article presents a well-researched history of repeating arms, including the Lorenzoni system and the Garadoni air rifle. Now, I'm not familiar with that other rifle that they're talking about or system. I am familiar with the Garadoni, and that was a really, really awesome air rifle, and it's interesting to see that mentioned in this particular article here because the Garadoni was a really, really awesome, reasonably good powered air rifle. It was a repeater. It held a lot of shots. I think it held like 17 shots, and Lewis and Clark in their expeditions actually used the Garadoni rifle. And they demonstrated the rifle to the natives as they were traveling throughout in their travels. And the Indians thought that it was magic. They were like, oh, this is a lightning rifle, wind rifle. They were very intimidated by this weapon that Lewis and Clark had. And it was, arguably the Garadoni that actually caused Lewis and Clark to be able to continue on their journey and not get completely annihilated by the natives, who probably, if they had the same arms as the natives, they might not have done so well. But it is interesting to mention the Garadoni, and it's an air rifle, which is really crazy to think that the air rifle technology in those days was so good that it actually was better than some of the black powder muskets that were out there. And it was a repeater, which for back in the day, that was a pretty important distinction for any type of military arm or civilian arm, much less something like an air rifle. So probably one of the coolest air rifles in the history of air rifles. I digress. Starting on page 40, the article goes into tremendous detail about privately owned cannons. The article is about an American who was hauled into a British court on a charge of planning to arm a Canadian revolt. The British Navy had seized 20,000 muskets and 24 field pieces from him in a shipment from France to America. Allen, quote, "The freedom Americans always enjoyed to possess the arms of one's choosing was reflected in Ira Allen's defense when he was seized by British forces in 1796 while transporting 20,000 muskets and 24 field pieces. Field piece would be cannons and other artillery, of course, from France to America. Allen said the arms were for Vermont's militia, whereas the British suspected he was planning to arm a Canadian revolt against the British. He was prosecuted in Britain's Court of Admiralty. At trial, the idea of one's individual possessing 20,000 arms was received with skepticism. Allen retorted that in America, arms and military stores are free merchandise, so that any who have property and choose to sport with it may turn their gardens into parks of artillery and their houses into arsenals without danger to government. The arms were restored to Allen. Wow. What a crazy story. Could you imagine if that happened today? If someone had 20,000 guns and the government got wind of it and wanted to be all uppity about it and tried to claim, that you were up to no good just because you happen to have a lot of guns? What this proves, though, is that it's not about how many guns you have. You have the right to have them, okay? And at the end of the day, that's what the Second Amendment's all about, the ability to stand up to tyranny. That is literally why it exists and why it's codified into our founding documents. Like, it's part of who we are. It's our heritage to be able to stand up to tyranny. On page 46, the article explains the obvious reasons for the creation of the Second Amendment in the American Bill of Rights. Naturally, after facing the threat of disarmament and thus certain destruction, America's founders were extremely protective of the right to bear arms. Before, during, and after the Revolution, no state banned any type of arm, ammunition, or accessory, nor did the Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, or the federal government created by the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Instead, the discussions about arms during the ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights centered on ensuring that the people had enough firepower to resist a tyrannical government. There is no evidence that any of the founders were concerned about individuals having too much firepower. After a long, grueling war against the world's strongest military, limiting individuals' capabilities was not a concern, obviously. The article includes an excellent history of firearms manufacturing in the United States and how it was encouraged and subsidized by the federal government. The article examines in detail what firearms bans were enacted up to 1900. Summation of firearms bans in the 1800s. In sum, the 19th century history of firearms bans is not helpful for justifying prohibitions on semi-automatic rifles. The only pre-1900 statutory precedent for such a law is Florida in 1893, and it is dubious. Before that, there were 3 prior sales prohibitions that covered many or most handguns. One of these was held to violate the Second Amendment, and the other 2 are plainly unconstitutional under Heller. Accordingly, renewed attention is being given to precedents involving Bowie knives, which we will examine next. There are entire sections of the law on Bowie knives and weapons that were not firearms or bladed weapons. The article notes throughout the historical period and military arms were protected. The article notes throughout the historical period and military arms were more protected than non-military arms. Gotcha. The article ends with a doctrinal analysis of the historical record as it applies to the Second Amendment through the Bruen decision. This is an impressive scholarly work. It will be referred to in cases involving the Second Amendment in the foreseeable future. And of course, they give you a bit of an idea of everything that's in that particular, study and everything. So see, that's exactly the type of things that are happening right now. And the reason that this is important to talk about and to start getting fresh in our minds is because soon, eventually, whether or not the government likes it or not, they're not going to have a choice. They are going to have to provide some form of historical reference for why their gun control laws are allowed to exist under the Bruen decision. And that's why they want that litmus test to be like the 1860s. They don't want it to be the actual founding of the country. They don't want it to go all the way back to 1791 because it's going to paint a very negative picture of, their efforts, right? We've known this for years. This is not anything new. We've always, when you've heard people say the NFA is unconstitutional, right? Gun laws are unconstitutional. And people go, well, of course it's not unconstitutional. The government did it. It can't be unconstitutional. Oh, that's totally arguable. And now it is not only arguable, but the case can be made in court and using this as a legitimate legal defense, a legitimate legal argument. And the government must muster, they must pass the smell test of Bruen in order for these things to stand. Now, we're talking, this is going to take years. It could take decades, right? The government loves to slow things down in court because the thing is that the longer it takes something to go through court, the less public interest is garnered for it, right? Once people stop paying attention to it, maybe the perception is that people don't care about it as much. Maybe the diehard people that really do care about the issue at hand, that group, maybe shrinks and kind of dwindles in numbers to where it's a much more opposable type of argument, right? So that's the issue. And that's why it's important that we always communicate these ideas to each other and that we are, very active when it comes to the advocacy of the Second Amendment because we have to keep public interest up on these types of topics. We have to make people understand why the Second Amendment is important, why we cannot allow these infringements on our Second Amendment rights to continue, right? It's not enough to simply just own a gun and be a gun owner. That doesn't necessarily make you pro-gun. It can make you, that's a start, of course. But understanding the real sort of quasi-spiritual reason in a way, the real essence of what the Second Amendment means, what it protects, what it acknowledges that you have at your disposal as a citizen of the country you live in. That is a very important thing that we have to consistently push home. And the mainstream media and all these social media companies and just all of the large machine, as it exists, this giant propaganda machine that's at large, they do not want people to have the unadulterated and unmodified facts about what their rights really mean, where it came from. And as we see the Bruen situation start to unfold, you're going to see that originally gun laws that did exist and that did prohibit certain people from owning guns. It does not paint the picture they want you to know about. And that is that it was often slaves, people of African descent. They didn't want black people having guns. Look, that's just the truth, right? There were even some religious sects that they didn't want having guns. It's how bad it was. That's how divided people were. So it's a terrible situation, but the reality is that whatever standing they do have in terms of historical text, tradition, and all that good stuff that Bruen mentions, it's not going to be the standing that they're proud to admit that, hey, this is the litmus test. Here is your historical reference, and they hand you a sheet, and it's a whole bunch of stuff from the slave code talking about how slaves can't own guns and things like that. And they're going to use that as a legal argument to justify why now the bulk of society should now be affected by laws that were similar to essentially keeping people that weren't viewed as free men from owning a gun. I don't think that's going to go over too well. Now, the past is the past, and it's not perfect. And I'm not proud of a lot of things that have happened in our country over the years. But the truth of the matter is we can dwell on all of that, or we can realize that we're here and they're not. Those people aren't here anymore, okay? But we are. So we can build a better world that we're proud of living in. But we have to have the courage to view the past as a learning experience and go, all right, how in the world do we move forward from this and become better for it? We know the answer. You know the answer in your heart. Even if you hate guns, you know when you turn on the news and you see the crazy things that these people are saying, ask yourself if you really, truly believe what they're peddling. I think the reality of the situation is that most people with a half a bit of sense probably need to own a gun, and they need to understand why they really need to own a gun. Just get rid of the rhetoric, throw it all out the door, and I think in time, you give yourself enough time, you'll realize that gun ownership is an extremely important thing, and we should fight for it tooth and nail. The First and Second Amendment, they're near the top of the list for a reason. Okay, so great article. I really enjoyed this one. I wanted to share it because it just has some great information. Anything that historical is always fun, but there's more. That's just scratching the surface of what these old scholarly, sort of reports bring into the equation for the Bruen landscape, the post-Bruen landscape. So thank you all very much. Many more videos on the way, and we'll see you soon.